what truly makes you you? I mean, is it the actual stuff you're made of, like your genetic code passed down? Or is it more about everything you experience, everything you learn, basically from the moment you're born?
Yeah, that's such a fundamental question, isn't it? It's captivated thinkers for, well, centuries. And it really gets to the heart of that classic nature versus nurture debate.
Exactly. People have been wrestling with it forever, biology or environment. Which one shapes us more?
And, spoiler alert, it's usually more complicated than just versus.
Right. So in this deep dive, that's what we want to do. We're going to tackle this complex question, look at it head on. We've got a whole stack of sources here, articles, research reviews, historical stuff. And we want to explore the history, look at the science people use to try and answer it, dig into some pretty significant critiques of that science.
Yeah.
And see how our understanding has kind of moved on, maybe beyond that simple versus.
Absolutely. So the mission here is really to unpack what these sources tell us is important about this whole discussion. Maybe we should start just by defining the terms, how the sources lay them out.
Good idea. Let's dive in. Okay, first up, nature. What did the sources mean by that?
Well, nature generally refers to the qualities we inherit, our biological inheritance.
So genetics?
Genetics, yeah. And the sort of evolutionary foundation for behavior.
Yeah.
It often emphasizes the differences between people that come from their genes, basically the DNA you start with.
Got it. Okay, and then nurture.
Now, nurture is interesting because its definition has really, expanded quite a bit over time. Historically, it was much narrower.
Like just how your parents raised you? Your mom, maybe?
Pretty much, yeah. Focused on parental care. Often the mother's role was highlighted. But now, it means basically all the environmental factors.
All of them?
Everything, including stuff before you're even born, the prenatal environment.
Ah, right. Like what the mother eats or medical care.
Exactly. Nutrition, medical care, any drugs you might be exposed to, even accidents. That's all part of the nurture picture, biologically speaking, before birth.
That's a key point. Environment starts way earlier than most people probably think, in the womb.
Absolutely. And then, after birth, nurture is everything else.
Yeah.
Your personal experiences, the circumstances you grow up in, what you learn,
Okay.
your social background, political climate, family, friends, school, community, the media you see, the whole culture. It's just this huge umbrella term now for all environmental influences.
Wow. Okay. So it's really broad. So where did this split, this idea of nature versus nurture, actually come from? The sources trace it back philosophically, right?
Yeah, way back. On the nature side, you've got ideas tied to nativism.
Nativism.
The belief that, lots of our abilities and traits are just inborn, determined by our heredity. Plato, for instance, argued along those lines.
Okay, so Plato was team nature, kind of.
You could say that, yeah. And then countering that, you have empiricism, which emphasizes learning and experience.
Yeah. And Aristotle was more on that side.
Aristotle highlighted the role of nurture and environment, yes. But a really key figure the sources talk about is John Locke, back in the 17th century.
Ah, Locke, the blank slate guy.
Exactly, tabula rasa. He's strongly associated with empiricism, suggesting the mind at birth is essentially empty, a blank slate, and knowledge comes mostly from our senses, from experiencing the world.
But hang on, the sources point out he wasn't like 100% nurture, was he? Didn't he leave some room for innate things?
That's a really important nuance, yeah. He talked about the blank slate mainly for knowledge, but he definitely acknowledged what he called natural tendencies.
Like what?
Things like curiosity,
Yeah.
a love of liberty. He also noted that kids, even really young ones, show different personalities, different likes and dislikes right from the get-go.
Okay, so not totally blank then. And he thought parents and education was super important.
Hugely important, especially for shaping character, what he called gentlemen. He felt manners and abilities owed more to their education than to anything else. He saw parents as laying the, quote, first foundations of virtue through discipline, habit formation.
Right.
He even pointed out that kids are really sensible of praise and commendation. They respond to positive reinforcement.
That sounds pretty modern, actually.
It does. And it's interesting to compare him with someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's also mentioned. Rousseau had a different take on education.
How so?
Well, unlike Locke's emphasis on sort of social expectations and habits, Rousseau was more about naturalistic education. Let kids follow their natural inclinations, learn by exploring the world directly through their senses, not just from books or strict rules.
Let kids be kids, kind of.
Sort of, yeah. He thought things like self-esteem were natural, and reason could guide them. Less about imposing structure, more about nurturing what's already there.
Okay, so deep philosophical roots for this whole debate. But the actual phrase nature-nurture that came later.
Much later, yes. Francis Galton coined it in 1883. The sources really highlight him as a pioneer in studying individual differences systematically, looking specifically at heredity's role.
Right. And this is where, as you mentioned, things get complicated and problematic. Galton founded the eugenics movement.
He did. And the sources are very clear about this. It had horrifying consequences, obviously. One source even states he endorsed genocide.
Wow.
Yet at the same time, he's credited with setting up the modern science of nature and nurture. It's a really difficult legacy.
Yeah, the sources really grapple with that. One says it takes major surgery to separate his racism from his scientific methods.
And they also point out that this new science he kind of kicked off tried to turn what were fundamentally personal, philosophical, even theological questions about who we are
Into purely scientific ones.
Exactly. Attempting to measure and quantify things that maybe aren't easily measured or quantified in that way.
That definitely puts the whole field's origins in a certain light. Okay, so moving on from this complex origins, how did scientists actually try to study this? What were the methods?
Well, the main approach, as the sources describe it, was basically comparing people. Comparing people with different amounts of genetic similarity and different environmental backgrounds.
Okay.
And the classic tools for this were twin studies.
Right. Comparing identical and fraternal twins.
Exactly. Identical twins, MZ, share 100% of their genes. Fraternal twins, DZ, share about 50%, just like regular siblings.
So the thinking was, if identical twins are way more similar on some trait, like personality or IQ, than fraternal twins are.
Then genes must be playing a role. That was the core logic.
And they also used adoption studies.
Yes, adoption studies, too. Looking at kids adopted away from their biological parents, you compare them to their biological family shared genes, different environment, and to their adoptive family shared environment, different genes.
Trying to tease apart the influences.
Trying to, yeah. And within that, the studies that got a lot of attention were the twins reared apart studies, TRA studies.
Identical twins separated at birth and raised in different families.
That was the ideal, yeah. The idea was if these genetically identical individuals grew up in totally different environments but still ended up really similar, that would seem like incredibly strong evidence for genetic influence, wouldn't it? Because the environment was supposedly controlled for by being different.
It sounds pretty compelling on the surface, like a natural experiment.
It does. But, and this is a big but, our sources spend a lot of time going through some major critiques of these methods. And understanding these critiques is really crucial for seeing why the thinking has shifted.
Okay, let's get into those. What were the main problems?
Well, a really big one for regular twin studies, comparing identicals and fraternals raised together, is something called the equal environments assumption, the EEA.
Equal environments, meaning the assumption that identical twins' environments aren't any more similar than fraternal twins' environments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The method kind of relies on that assumption being true, so you can isolate the genetic difference.
Yeah.
But critics argue it's often just false.
Why? Because identical twins look the same.
That's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
They look alike, they're often dressed alike, treated as a unit, people might confuse them. Their experiences can actually be much more similar than those of fraternal twins, who might be different sexes, look totally different.
So if identical twins turn out more similar, it might not just be their shared genes, it could be their more similar environments too.
Precisely. It confounds the results. Even some of the early behavioral geneticists themselves apparently had doubts about the EE's validity. They acknowledged that twin differences could be due to heredity or environment or some interaction that's really hard to pull apart.
Okay.
And some critics go even further, questioning if the twin method itself, because it relies so heavily on this potentially flawed assumption, is even a valid way to detect genetic influence on behavior specifically.
Wow. Okay. So that casts doubt on a lot of the foundational research. What about those twins reared apart studies? The ones that sounded so powerful.
They face serious critiques too. One major point is that many of these pairs weren't actually truly reared apart in the way you might imagine.
How so?
Well, they might have spent some time together as infants before being separated. Or maybe they were placed in adoptive homes that were deliberately chosen because they were similar, maybe similar socioeconomic status, similar cultural background to the biological parents, so the environments weren't always that different or randomly assigned.
So not a perfectly clean separation of genes and environment.
Often not, no.
Yeah.
And the sources also raise specific issues with some famous TRA studies, like the Minnesota study.
What kind of issues?
Things like allegations that control group data might have been left out, or that researchers might have engaged in questionable statistical practices to get significant results, sometimes called p-hacking.
P-hacking?
Yeah.
Like fishing for statistically significant findings.
Kind of, yeah. Analyzing the data in different ways until something significant pops up. The sources suggest this might have been an issue.
Okay, that's concerning.
And there's another really interesting critique mentioned about IQ correlations in these separated twins.
Yeah.
One source suggests that a big chunk of the similarity in IQ scores might not just be genes, but could be explained by the simple fact that they share a birth date.
How does sharing a birth date explain IQ similarity?
Because it means they grew up experiencing the same historical period, the same societal changes, including whatever factors contribute to the Flynn effect.
A Flynn effect. That's the general rise in IQ scores over generations.
Exactly. It's thought to be driven by broad environmental factors, better nutrition, more schooling, more complex environments. So twins born on the same day experience that same historical uplift together, which could inflate their IQ similarity beyond just genetics.
Huh. I never thought of that. So even the gold standard studies have these potential confounding factors.
It seems so, according to these critiques. And all this skepticism feeds into another point the sources raise about something called the first law of behavior genetics.
Okay, what's that?
It's a statement by a researcher named Eric Turkheimer, and it basically says all human behavioral traits are heritable, meaning genetics plays some role in almost everything.
That sounds like a strong claim, a law.
Well, that's the critique. Is it really a scientific law, like in physics?
Yeah.
Or is it more of a summary, a kind of theory or model based on the results from those very twin and adoption studies that are being questioned?
Right. If the methods are flawed, maybe the law isn't so solid.
That's the argument. The sources even note that Turkheimer himself has apparently acknowledged his laws aren't quite laws in the strictest sense.
Interesting. And there's another line of criticism too, right, about finding the actual genes?
Yes. One source points to what it calls decades of failed causal gene discovery attempts for many complex behaviors.
Meaning, if twin studies say something like personality or mental illness is, say, 50% heritable?
Then you'd expect us to have found the specific genes responsible for that 50% by now, with modern genomics. But for many traits, it's been incredibly difficult. We find genes that have tiny, tiny effects, but not the major genes suggested by the heritability estimates from twin studies.
Where has that gap been particularly noticeable?
The sources use schizophrenia research as a kind of case study, describing it pretty starkly as a field where theories go to die.
Ouch.
Yeah. Critiques mentioned include things like maybe broadening the definition of the illness over time or using larger and larger sample sizes until something statistically significant shows up again, raising that concern about p-hacking. If the genetic signal is so hard to find reliably, it challenges the initial assumptions about high heritability.
It really paints a picture of a scientific field grappling with some fundamental challenges. And we have to remember that historical context you mentioned earlier, too.
Absolutely. The sources remind us that some of the earliest efforts to collect data on populations, twins, and psychiatric conditions in Europe were explicitly linked to eugenics.
Like trying to track hereditary diseases or racial characteristics.
Exactly. The sources mention that chilling example from Nazi Germany in 1939, trying to register all twins to study nature-nurture for the human racial constitution. And a Danish registry from 1938, tracking patients with severe hereditary diseases. Presenting these facts just highlights the deeply unsettling historical baggage connected to some of this research.
It really does. It forces you to think critically about where the questions and methods came from. Okay, so given all these critiques, all these challenges to the traditional way of studying nature versus nurture, where does that leave us? What's the current understanding?
Well, the clear message from the sources is that the whole nature versus nurture framing, it's seen by most scientists and thinkers today as just way too simple. It's outdated.
So it's not an either-or fight.
Not at all. The focus isn't really on asking how much anymore, trying to pin a percentage on genes and a percentage on environment. That's seen as kind of missing the point.
So what's the question now?
It shifted to asking, how do they interact? It's about understanding the dynamic, ongoing interplay between our biology and our environment. It's a qualitative question about the process, not just quantifying the inputs.
Okay, interaction, not opposition. That feels like a much more realistic way to think about it.
Definitely. And the sources point out that understanding this interaction ties into other really big fundamental debates in psychology and philosophy. These add even more layers to understanding who we are.
Like what kind of debates?
Well, for instance, the classic debate around free will versus determinism.
Ah, okay. Is our behavior something we freely choose, or is it caused by prior events, whether biological or environmental?
Exactly. Determinism is the idea that behavior has causes. But even that isn't simple. The sources mention behavior can be overdetermined.
Meaning it has lots of causes all acting at once.
Right. And there's also fortuity chance events, unpredictable influences. Plus, determinism itself isn't monolithic. There's hard determinism.
Which says everything is automatic, like clockwork. No real choice, no responsibility.
Kind of, yeah. Behavior is seen as a direct, mechanical result of prior causes. But then there's soft determinism.
Which is more of a middle ground?
Sort of a compromise, yeah. It suggests that, yes, behavior is caused, but those causes can include our own internal cognitive processes, our thoughts, intentions, beliefs, our deliberations.
So our choices and thoughts are part of the causal chain.
Exactly. Which allows for a concept of personal responsibility, even within a broadly deterministic view. Our conscious mind plays a causal role.
Okay, that makes sense. So our biology and environment might set things up, but our thinking can still influence the outcome.
That's the idea soft determinism tries to capture. Another related big one is a mind-body problem.
How does our mental world, thoughts, feelings, consciousness relate to our physical brain and body?
Right. It's a classic puzzle. You had historical views like materialism, everything is just physical stuff. Or idealism, reality is fundamentally mental or conscious. And then dualism.
Like Descartes. Mind and body are totally separate things.
Yeah. Descartes' interactionism proposed a distinct, non-physical mind that somehow interacted with the physical body, maybe via the pineal gland. But as the sources note, that view hasn't really held up scientifically.
So what's a more current view?
A view more aligned with modern thinking mentioned in the sources is Spinoza's double aspectism.
Double aspectism.
Yeah, the idea that mind and body aren't separate things interacting, but rather two inseparable aspects or perspectives of the same underlying reality, like two sides of one coin.
Okay, so what happens physically in the brain is experienced mentally and vice versa. They're just different ways of describing the same event.
That's the gist. Not two substances, but one substance with two facets. This kind of thinking influenced ideas like psychical determinism, the idea that our mental lives also have causes and follow patterns that can be studied.
Interesting. So these philosophical debates really underpin how we even think about studying behavior. What else?
There's also the whole debate about the individual and society.
Right. Do we focus just on the person, or do we have to understand them within their social world?
Exactly. Early psychology often tried to study the individual in isolation. But later views really stressed how much we're shaped by our environment and society.
Like Kurt Lemon's ideas.
Yes, his field theory emphasized understanding people within the dynamic field of their interactions with their environment. You can't separate the person from the situation.
Which leads to the person-situation debate, right? Is behavior mostly about your personality traits, or does the situation dictate how you act?
That's it. Many social psychologists have shown the power of the situation, arguing people are actually quite malleable and adapt to social context. But others argue, personality still matters. Different people react differently to the same situation.
So it's another interaction.
Seems like it. And the idea of reciprocal determinism captures that nicely. It's not just situation influencing person or person choosing situation. It's a two-way street. The individual acts on the environment shapes the individual back and forth constantly.
Okay. And then there's the ecological perspective. That sounds even broader.
It is. Frameworks like Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory really zoom out. They show individuals nested within multiple layers of environmental influence.
Layers? Like what?
Like the immediate settings, family, school, peers,
Yeah.
the microsystem. Then the connections between those settings, the mesosystem. Then broader social structures that affect you indirectly, like parents' workplaces or community services, the exosystem. Then the overarching culture, laws, values,
Yeah.
the macrosystem. And even how these change over time, the chronosystem.
Wow, so it's like concentric circles of influence all interacting.
Exactly. It really drives home how interconnected the individual is with society at multiple levels and how all these levels shape development and behavior.
So, okay, if we move beyond the simple nature versus nurture fight, and we consider this incredibly complex web biology, multiple environmental layers, free will determinism, mind, body, individual, society, it's a lot. how do we actually use this more complex understanding?
Well, one interesting concept brought up in the sources is actionability.
Actionability.
Yeah. Instead of getting bogged down in what's fixed or uncontrollable, like your specific genes or things that happen in your past environment, this idea shifts the focus. It asks, what can we actually do about the consequences or the effects of these factors?
Ah, okay. So maybe you can't change a genetic risk, but you can take actions to manage that risk or mitigate its impact. Change your behavior, modify your environment.
Exactly. It's about focusing on intervention points. And the source critiques that old saying, genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger.
Why critique that? It sounds kind of intuitive.
Because it's seen as too fatalistic. It implies environment only acts as a negative trigger for bad genetic predispositions.
Hmm.
But environment does so much more.
Right. It can be protective.
It can be protective, it can be beneficial, it can promote resilience, it can actively prevent a predisposition from ever showing up.
Hmm.
Environment isn't just about pulling triggers, it's also about building buffers, providing opportunities, fostering health.
So it's not just managing risk, it's also about enabling potential.
Precisely. And this idea of actionability might need to be broader than just, say, getting a genetic test result that leads to a specific pill or surgery.
How so?
Well, information about your genetics or your environmental risks could be considered actionable, even if there's no immediate medical fix. Maybe it helps you understand your ancestry. Maybe it informs decisions about having children. Maybe it prompts you to rethink major life plans, like career or lifestyle choices.
Even if a doctor can't prescribe anything based on it.
Right. If the information has practical value for how you navigate your life, understand yourself, or make future plans, then it's actionable in this broader sense. It empowers informed decision-making.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about the usefulness of the knowledge for living your life. Okay, so let's zoom back out. After digging into all these sources, what's the main takeaway here about what makes you, you?
I think the core message is that the old nature versus nurture fight, it's just not the right way to think about it. It's fundamentally inadequate. What emerges instead is this picture of a really complex, dynamic, interacting system. Our biology, our genes, our physiology is constantly interacting with our environment.
And environment means everything, from inside the womb to the whole culture.
Exactly. Prenatal factors, family, peers, school, culture, media, historical moment. All of it. And this interaction isn't static. It's ongoing, shaping and reshaping us throughout our entire lives.
And throwing in those other big questions, free will, the mind-body connection, our place in society just adds even more layers of complexity and richness to the picture.
It really does. It moves us way beyond a simple biological or environmental determinism to something much more nuanced and, frankly, more interesting.
So thinking about all of that, this incredibly intricate dance between your genes, all those layers of environment constantly influencing you, the philosophical questions about choice and consciousness and this idea of actionability, using this knowledge to navigate life, how might really grasping this complexity change how you, the listener, think about things, like how you think about your own potential or personal responsibility, or maybe even how we should design our communities, our schools, our policies?